Daubers Online under my time as master. So thank you very, very much indeed. Many of you have been to some or all of the previous events, and so far they've all been very good, and tonight I know will turn out to be just as interesting. The only problem is that I'm doing the slides, so I'm really hoping that between Claire's eloquent words and my slide pushing, we'll get there. So can I introduce Dr. Claire Gapper? Some of you again will have met her. Claire is the leading academic on historic heritage plasterwork. And in the year that Tim Cook was master, she took us on a fantastic walk around the city, starting at the Charter House, ending up at Ironmonger's Hall. And suddenly we could all look at lots of churches and other buildings, livery halls, and see the plasterwork and just understand so much more. And she's going to do that same kind of forensic sort of engagement on just one particular house in Rochester today. And I've seen the slides, as I said, and it's really interesting. Her PhD was on decorative plasterwork in the city, court and country, 1530 to 1640, which she did at the Courtauld Institute of Art in 1998. I hope that's all right, Claire. And well, I've got to say, Claire has got this fantastic website, which has got huge amounts of information about plasterers, plasterwork, buildings. It's all open and free source to us, so it's really great. So Claire, shall I, do you want to just say hello so we can see you? Because when I put the slides up, you sort of go into a little box. So if you start talking, if you could all put yourself on mute, please, if you're not talking, and I'll put myself on mute as well. So, and then tell me when to share the screen, Claire, but just say hello first of all.
Hello, everybody. Great to see you all. Thank you very much for coming along. Okay, shall we start then? Great. There we go. If we could have the first slide then, Alison. There we go. Now, Eastgate House is a property of Medway Council, and they undertook a major rethink earlier in this century about how to refurbish and represent it in a more satisfactory way than it has been in recent years. It was opened in 2017, but of course is now closed again. But it survived various incarnations over the centuries, but to secure its future now, it needs more visitors. So I hope once it reopens to the public, you will make a trip down to Rochester to have a look. It's among the oldest domestic buildings surviving in Rochester, and its interiors are even more fascinating than its exteriors. First, a brief outline of the history of the ownership of the house, because that has significantly influenced its current presentation. From about the 1580s until 1687, the house was the family home of the Buck family, Peter Buck and his descendants. In the will of Peter Buck III, and they were all called Peter Buck, in 1655, it was described as a capital mansion with all edifices, buildings, courtyards, backsides, orchards and gardens, with all appurtenances belonging thereto. So clearly a property of much greater extent than is now apparent. According to the hearth tax of 1664, it had 10 hearths. It continued to be occupied as a family home under different ownership until it became a free school in the late 18th century and a girls' boarding school in 1841. By then it had already featured in the Pickwick Papers as Westgate in 1836, and Dickens rechristened it the Nun's House in The Mystery of Edwin Drood in 1870. You cannot escape Dickens in Rochester. In the 1870s, it became a private house once again, until in 1890 it was used as a young men's hostel, and then as a temperance restaurant. It was rescued from this dire fate in 1897 by Rochester City Council, who converted the building into a municipal library and museum to celebrate Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1903. They undertook a major restoration, attempting to rescue the early fabric from later accretions, some of which had already been removed in the 19th century, as you can see by looking at early Ordnance Survey maps. This restoration was to a large extent meticulous and well documented, with before and after plans drawn up, but puzzles remain. Fixtures and fittings, especially chimney pieces, door frames and panelling, of appropriate date, were brought in from local buildings such as the Red Lion Inn at Frindsbury, which were demolished, and many, but not all, still bear helpful brass labels. There in the middle you see a little label telling you exactly where it was from. So it's the right sort of date, but was not in situ. Further restoration work was carried out in the 1960s, and where some rebuilding of the brick bay windows was necessary, accurate reconstructions aimed to replicate the original build. Dickens' house at nearby Gad's Hill became a school in 1960, and a new home was needed for the Swiss chalet that had been given to the author by a friend to provide a writing shed in his garden. There it is on the right. It was originally a flat pack. It was re-erected behind Eastgate House in 1961. Not surprising, therefore, that when the museum was moved to Rochester Guildhall in 1979, Eastgate House became the Dickens Centre. And this is how I first encountered the building, with endearing holographic characters from the novels addressing the visitor in just a few of the rooms, but not those of most interest. And I am, of course, referring to those with decorative plaster ceilings. The Dickens Centre closed in 2004, and apart from a brief spell when it reopened as a centre for local art and history events, it was not until Medway Council obtained a Heritage Lottery grant that its future was rethought, allowing the building and its history to become the main feature for visitors to engage with and enjoy. So, back now to the house, beginning with a tour of the exterior. Not every room in the house is open to the public, and new toilets and a lift have been installed, but every effort has been made to combine these alterations to parts of the house that are of less significance than those that you do see. So at the top of the plan there is the outer wall of Rochester. Yes, that's the Eastgate, and so Eastgate House is just further up towards the top of the plan, somewhere up there. It's not very clear which property that was, but it's up there somewhere. Now, there's a showy timber-framed wing fronting the High Street, and it's combined, unusually for Kent, with a brick side elevation, incorporating an integral chimney. Here we go. And a polygonal stair turret, which provided an observation point from its top. That strange little gabled roof on top, as you can see, doesn't really fit, and that's an 18th century addition. Brickwork is quite fancy and includes even this kind of strange detail there. And then there's a panel with Peter Buck's heraldic badge, and as you can imagine, they're all very keen on their heraldry. This is further down the façade with an entry porch. Interior features dated 1590 and 1591 have suggested a date for the first and second phases of Buck's building, but it's apparent that the earliest surviving range facing the street had no direct external access and may have been attached to an earlier hall house on the site that Peter Buck began to refurbish and replace in a fairly piecemeal fashion from the mid-1580s onwards. Buck was not a local man. He was born the eldest son of a Southampton gentleman, and both he and his second wife, Mary Cresswell, also from Hampshire, came from armigerous families, as will become increasingly apparent inside. In 1582, he was appointed a crown servant to Elizabeth I's Navy at Chatham, where he was keeper of the prick and check of mariners and artificers' wages, and of the book of reports of all manner of provisions delivered to Her Majesty. Clearly a post of considerable responsibility, and its holder would need a house to indicate this status to his neighbours. It therefore seems likely that Buck acquired an existing house in the 1580s and perhaps began rebuilding after his second marriage, which must have taken place in about 1585. Mary had produced 4 children by 1592. Buck became Mayor of Rochester in 1593 and was promoted to be Clerk of the Ships in 1596. He was knighted during a royal visit in 1604, so that's James I. And when in 1606 James was accompanied on a second visit by his brother-in-law Christian IV, the Danish king stayed at Eastgate House and presented Buck with a silver-gilt standing cup. The prospect of a royal guest may have prompted further extensions, but they may also have occurred after Sir Peter Buck's death in 1625, when the house was shared by his widow and their son Peter II with his family. The house was enlarged by Buck and his descendants with no coherent overall plan over many decades, and as a consequence it's impossible to detect a conventional layout that can be ascribed to any particular date. And it's also resulted in changes of floor level between various phases, requiring steps to navigate between rooms, as you're about to discover. When you visit, and you surely will, it is easy to move across the house horizontally at each level, but I will try to show you all the levels of each phase vertically in turn. I don't think you will be happy with all the paint colours, which it is claimed result from analysis, but I don't know by whom, nor with the intrusive ironmongery required for fire doors or the prominent white radiators. And apologies for the floral arrangements. Last summer's exhibition was devoted to weddings. So if we have a look first at the plan, you can see that we're starting with the red block is the initial build, where the interior seems to be 1590. The blue square next to it is 1591. And then the green and mauvey colour are slightly later. But the mauvey colour is an 18th century lean-to that it is still there, but it's replacing what should have been a much wider green room. It should have had 2 bays. And then finally, the pink and yellow at the back are added early, sort of second quarter of the 17th century. So we start then on the red block at the bottom. This is now shown as Peter Buck's study, which is a reasonable name for it, I think, because he clearly would need somewhere to do business, and the ground floor seems as good a place as any. There's some original panelling, although some of it is also brought in from elsewhere. And you can see that the windows are very high on this street front to provide privacy. The chimneypiece is from that red line in at Frindsbury that we saw before. And from this room, you have access up that stair tower to the floor above, which could well have been a parlour. And here we have the first of the wonderful plaster ceilings. You can see there is a very fine timber overmantel, very beautifully carved, very, very dainty compared with the robust modelling of the ceiling. And that is where you find the date of 1590, very helpfully. And the ceiling layout there. I'm very grateful to the plaster conservator who provided me these stitched together overall plans for the ceiling. If we then go on up the stairs again, the space was divided into 2 rooms, both with fireplaces, so they may well have been bedchambers. You have yet more panelling and chimneypiece with less elaborate overmantel, but still finely carved. Ceiling, there we go. And then the adjoining room, there, yet another fireplace, timber overmantel, and the ceiling. There we go. Then the floor above, I haven't a slide to show you because this little room is thought to have been an observation room. It's not now accessible to visitors, but it did have a view across the River Medway to Chatham dockyard, which might well have been something Peter Buck felt was necessary. Now I'm going to pause here for a digression, or perhaps you won't think it's a digression, because I'm sure you will expect me to talk about the plaster ceilings that you've just seen. And there is no decorative plasterwork elsewhere in the house, so this seems the best place to discuss it. Now, I'm sure you all know this basic construction ceilings, but I'll just give you a quick run through how you start off, probably splitting your laths, glass, and then nailing them up to the joists crossways, leaving gaps between. And luckily I have seen recently at Chirk Castle, they have been doing just this, repairing a ceiling, for you to see how it looks in real life rather than my odd little diagram. And then when you've added aggregates to your sand and hair, that's usually ox hair, and for fine work sometimes goat hair, white like this, chopping it. I'm sure they didn't have scissors to do it then. And then mix that in. Now, this is Phil Gates. He's making it look very easy. You can see from the documents that the apprentices and labourers had to beat the hair into plaster. And the next slide shows you that this is not really always very successful. And you do find clumps of hair that obviously have not been beaten very thoroughly. So you've now got your plaster ready to push up through those joists, and it splurges out behind the joist to provide the key that holds the ceiling in place. And here again, Chirk Castle shows you what it looks like from the back. And I have a little fragment here where you can see, typically at this period, it's only 2 coats of plaster, a rough base coat. You can see little fragments of hair, I hope, there, and then a finer top layer. And you can even, I hope, just make out the layer of whitewash on top. So there you have your basic surface on which you're then going to run the ribs. There's Phil holding his rib thumb mould, and then here he is giving a demonstration. And you end up with examples like these at Linstead Park, which is the right sort of date, 1599, or Newel staircase slightly later, 1605. And at Eastgate House, you can distinctly see that these are hand-run ribs. They're lovely and wobbly. So you've then got to decide the pattern that you're going to choose, and almost invariably they are laid out symmetrically to fit the space available. The plasterer did take considerable trouble to do that. Popular designs are the quatrefoil, which is what we see at Eastgate. Yeah. Then a star design, different variations on that. But again, Eastgate House has a sort of star there. Or something based around the Greek cross, that's again back at Linstead. And there again it is at Eastgate, combined with these sort of kites. So there's nothing of this early date surviving elsewhere in Rochester. The only comparable example I've encountered is a ceiling in the old house, Strand Street in Sandwich, which was purchased by William Randolph Hearst, and in 2013 was being taken out of store and reconstructed for a house in the USA. But I'm going to show it to you, a photograph of it before it left for America, obviously, because there is a boss there. You can see that you would normally expect that the intersection of ribs is used as a motif on its own in that little square pattern. Not exactly clear of the date, thank you, date of the ceiling, but it could have been from as early as 1573 when Queen Elizabeth visited Sandwich, or it was also known as the King's Lodging, so it may well have been a 17th century ceiling. In many other respects, the decorative plasterwork at Eastgate House is absolutely typical for its date. To provide variety, the plasterer used different rib outlines, profiles. You can see a sharp arris on the left and then that concave rib on the right. He used different bosses across at the rib intersections. And just as at Sandwich, he even used one boss as a motif on its own in that little concave square. When it came to decorating the fields between the ribs, the plaster was similarly conventional. There's plentiful display of the heraldry of Buck and his wife. There we go. Then there's the ever popular fleur-de-lis, comes up in different versions. Flowers make an appearance. We have pink there on the left and a little bunch of acorns on the right. The strapwork had not arrived on plaster ceilings by this date, except in the form of cartouches. And here they look as though the plasterer hasn't quite got the hang of this type of ornament, particularly the one on the right. On the other hand, he was very much happier with the sort of decoration which is known as grotesque. Writhing sea monsters are arranged to fit the differently shaped fields available. A merman with a cutlass grins down at us. And the plasterer seems to have been particularly proud of his merman and mermaid, who are disproportionately large for the small ceiling they occupy. And then ever popular animals make an appearance, often copied from bestiaries. They were hand modelled in fairly high relief. Here we have some lions, and then what I think are deer, and I hope you can just see that the legs actually are detached, the forelegs there are detached from the surface of the ceiling, so really very adventurous modelling. The tufts, I wondered for a long time what on earth those fluffy feet were supposed to be suggesting, but then I realised, looking at engraved sources, they're supposed to be the tufts of grass on which the animals are standing. So all this hand modelling would have been cheaper than the carved timber moulds that were used to create most of the surviving London ceilings, or ceilings by London plasterers, such as those at Linstead Park in Kent of 1599. This was a much grander country house where the patron could engage a plasterer from the capital. But again, you see very similar in design, much lower relief because this is all cast from moulds. Now, was the plasterer local or was he a Londoner? I'm afraid the lack of comparative examples makes it impossible to speculate. But why is there no surviving plasterwork in the phases that followed immediately afterwards? Has it been stripped out over the centuries of alternative uses? The next phase followed very shortly after, and it's dated 1591 by a beam on the first floor. If we go back to the ground floor, this now was the hall, it's now the entrance for ticket office and shop, as you can see, with a chimney piece that's supposed to be original. They think that they found it under wallpaper, and the caryatids they found from somewhere else. But actually, when you look closely, these things do not seem all to fit together terribly well. So I think we have a bit of creative restoration going on there. I mentioned before that there was not a lot of forward planning, and that there are changes of level between parts of the house as it was extended. This you can see here also, that you get a junction into, sorry, can you just go back? Yes, the junction there means that the external window of the stair turret is now on the inside, jammed up against a new window of the extension that's added. So this large room, I think, adjoining it must have been the great chamber. It has a very smart polygonal window bay. The beam across the ceiling is dated 1591 for us, and we have yet another timber over mantel, which is rather well splendidly carved. And then there are these steps between the two levels that quite a sharp difference in height between them. So not, as I said, not much forward planning. On the floor above, partitions are added which create two rooms and a passage. This is the larger of the two, which is now shown as a schoolroom, Those of you who, like me, were at school in the 1950s will probably recognise the desks. And there are even little china ink wells for the ink monitor to fill. And this is the adjoining room, again with a fireplace. And this room has wall paintings that have now been uncovered. I'm afraid this is why you're seeing it through a perspex screen. And then here is a close detail of it. There we go. Very dainty. Looking perhaps like a textile, but very attractive decoration. And then in the corridor behind these two rooms, you see the bottom of the Newel staircase that would have led, well, does lead up. This is the back stair, not in that stair turret, and it would have gone all the way down to the ground floor. It now only goes up to the top floor. I'm afraid you don't go up there because it is just so narrow and difficult of access. But if you have the time, I'd just like to tell you about what is up there. This is only recently uncovered. I'm sorry about the pictures. It's very difficult to photograph, and they haven't had professional pictures taken yet, so these are my very murky slides. But I will just do want to include them because it's something I was able to sort out for them. There are two figures there. One of them, at least, I can tell you, is King Arthur. Now, how do I know? Well, King Arthur and the other character, who is Godfrey of Bouillon, were two of the 9 worthies, the military heroes of the medieval period, who had a very long life in many different media and were extremely popular. I mean, perhaps after the Reformation, they were especially popular because you weren't going to be showing saints in your wall paintings or that kind of decoration, so they keep cropping up. Now, in the Middle Ages, they were given, no, you can carry on with the heraldry, they created shields for them. They are biblical, they're mythical, they're historical figures, Old Testament, New Testament, and I suspect they have chosen Godfrey of Bouillon and Arthur as the sort of Christian most recent characters. And it's because of their shield, their banners, that I was able to spot them, because these are full-length figures from Aston Hall in Birmingham. They are the whole frieze of them right round their room there. I wonder if, because they're at the top of the house, they have some sort of protective function. They often were very superstitious about the risk of evil spirits coming in through the top of the house and windows and such like. But unfortunately, there's nothing else in the rooms up there that suggests quite how they were used, or whether perhaps there may even be more worthies originally. Right. So if we go back now to the ground floor, just very quickly, we'll see what is now presented as a kitchen. Clearly, it was never a kitchen. It was even a bigger room, as I said, than it was. It lost one bay. The overmantel doesn't fit the fireplace, and the fireplace is certainly late 17th century in style. And then on the first floor, you have a nice bay window again, more panelling. And then in the room above, guess who? Dickens, as I said, there's no escaping him in Rochester. And they've used that room to make a display about the mystery of Edwin Drood. Above this, the room had a good-sized window and was warmed by a chimney stack. They're now completely bare and have lost their ceilings, but you can see from the nail marks on the joist that it was properly sealed. So I'm sure it was a habitable space. And then there's the porch that overlays the building behind it, so it must be slightly later. And the corporation added the classical pediment and pilasters. And then there's a little porch chamber above it, which provides a little more private space of the great chamber. And then at some point in the second quarter of the 17th century, the brick range was added behind, including a splendid new staircase, which rises to the first floor. And this probably happened after Peter Buck's death in 1625, when his widow was sharing the house with their son, Peter II, and his family. So you may well be thoroughly confused by my whistle-stop tour, but I hope it has whet your appetite for a visit to Eastgate House once it reopens. You need to check the website because it's not open every day, but it's not only 5 minutes from Rochester station, trains from St Pancras of Victoria, or there's a car park. And don't forget to fill in one of the cards to show Medway Council that you have visited and I hope enjoyed one of their best kept secrets. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to stop sharing, although the slides were wonderful. And hopefully you're all back. Whoa, great. Yeah, more people have joined. Fantastic. Well done, Claire. So I mean, I had a quick scoot through the slides earlier, but to hear all about them and to see those lovely ceilings, they just look fantastic. And I think Rochester isn't, what, more than 40 minutes on the train or something. It's very easy if we want to get out and about to go and have a look. And maybe you might even meet a group of us if we came and told us a little bit more.
I would love to. Yes.
You did say you don't. I'm going to ask people for questions in a minute. If you could wave at me if you want to ask a question. You did say that you didn't know who had been the plasterer, because obviously when you did the lovely tour around the city, what was so great is that you knew
Yes.
you know, Abraham Stanion or whoever it was did this ceiling or that ceiling, and it was so special because those names also meant something to us in the livery because they'd been members of the livery or even masters of the livery in the period. This is obviously more out in the country, but you don't know anything about the plasterers who might have done the work.
Sadly not. And as I say, there's just nothing really in Rochester, which is extraordinary, really. I suppose it has been lost because there must have been more. And you would have thought there was some documentation somewhere, but I'm afraid not.
Yeah. And the link with Dickens, apart from the fact that he used the house for two I think, novels, I mean, as far as you know, had he ever been there at all? I mean, his chalet was put there after, you know, in this century or last century, so he didn't have any physical connection with.
Well, yes, he grew up in the area. His father was in Chatham Dockyard, so yeah. He would have been very familiar with with Rochester High Street, certainly. Yes.
But he didn't live here or anything.
Oh,
but
no.
But it's great because of the Dickens connection. It means that there will be more people coming because it's such a draw to that part of the world to come and see something about Dickens, really.
I think they've been very wise to retain some Dickens element.
Yes. Now on the Zoom call, we've got lots of very, very established plasterers who I'm sure will be very interested in the technical detail. They may pick you up on some difficulty, or they may be able to enlighten us about how you can declump your hair. I don't know about that. And then there's other people like me who know zilch about really plasterwork. So I think you'll welcome all questions, won't you, from anybody? And I'm going to ask past Master Terry Wright, because he's always my go-to man, to ask a question about the plastering. Terry.
Well, actually, Claire, I'm not going to. Thank you very much. Very fascinating, and I'm surprised at just how much of the original has survived. And it's nice that it managed somehow to miss the ravages of the Victorian era when everything wanted to be changed. But looking at the building from the outside, it has a phenomenal number of windows. So how did the structure manage to avoid the window tax and the ravages of that at the end of the 17th century? Because I have worked on a number of buildings where the interiors have changed dramatically because of what happened in the. I'm going to show my ignorance here and say it was about the end of the 17th century when the window tax came in, and it lasted a long time, and it made people change both exterior and interior. And I'm fascinated to see all those windows continue to exist from that period.
Well, I think partly it's because the ownership wasn't owned by very wealthy people, and once it becomes a school and so forth, there is no real incentive to do anything more than you absolutely had to in the way of maintenance. I'm not sure that the window tax would have been too much of a trouble, or it may be that the corporation have opened up windows that had been lost as I say, they were definitely trying to get back to the original build. That plan showed you some of the accretions, but I think it had been, there were even more bits and pieces had been added on. So I think it was lucky that the decoration inside survived, because there was no money really to spend on doing what was fashionable and up to date. And for a school, you wouldn't bother really, I imagine, or even a temperance hotel, temperance restaurant.
But the only other thing that I might just sort of share with you is that clearly what you've talked about is the traditional method of production of a ceiling of that era in this country. Yep. There are other materials that are used in other countries which are, shall we say, less forgiving of our current sort of use of things like central heating. Mm-hmm. And a good example of this, I worked on the a building in Warsaw, which was the embassy for the British Embassy in Warsaw before the Iron Curtain came down, I might add. So it was somewhat difficult. And there, the actual structure for the ceiling was bamboo. And one of the problems with bamboo is that it's a very non-porous timber, and so that as soon as the dryness of the central heating came onto the building, the ceiling became a disaster area, especially since the Polish had used the rubble to provide an insulation between each of the floors. Exactly. So I mean, we are quite lucky in that we used oak riven lats, which have a reasonable amount of porosity, and have allowed us to use lime plaster as opposed to cementitious plaster, which then allows it to breathe. So some of our ceilings are able to survive instead of what's happened in some other countries. Yes,
and even retain a slight element of give, so that in timber frame buildings, you're going to get some movement, and lime plaster is able to contend with that.
I remember, Claire, when we came on your walk, that you were talking about the wobbly lines, that if it's got too straight a line, you knew they weren't the original. I think in Charterhouse, the ceiling there was one very small sort of alcove, which was clearly, it looked a bit, frankly, not very well looked after, but it was original because of the wobbly lines, whereas the rest of it, that's a great chamber of the Charterhouse, which is being refurbished again. So I don't know what's happening to that. Anyway, the Deputy Master, Tim, has a question. Tim.
Claire, thank you very much for that talk. Can you say something about the challenges of conserving ceilings at that age?
Well, I mean, the ceilings there have been conserved. While they were refurbishing, they were having to clean off the old layers of whitewash and sometimes even gloss paint that gets added over the years. And I went to see the conservator actually having to repair a hole where the workman above had put his foot through the ceiling. So amazingly, I find lime plaster, you can't tell where damage has happened. It really does blend very well. The repairs are hardly noticeable. But the main problems usually are damp, but not damp for the plaster so much, but damp for the laths, because if the laths fail, then you lose the key. So it's usually the laths that give problems before the lime plaster.
But does it also require sustaining a certain ambient temperature in rooms with ceilings of that age?
I don't think so, because if you think timber frame houses would have been not particularly warm, or in places they would be very warm. So I think, again, it's very, very forgiving as a material, much more so than plaster of Paris.
Yeah, so we've got a good product as plasterers, really.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah, resilient to climate change.
Indeed.
Now, who else has got a question to ask? James Minette, and then I'm coming to the Master-elect. James.
Very well. Hello, yes, good evening. Thank you very much for the presentation. I shall ask a possibly naive question, but I was interested just to see that those ceilings were all white.
Yes.
There was very little colour in
Yes.
it at all, and I didn't know whether that was the fashion statement of the time or there's more to it.
No, absolutely the fashion statement of the time, particularly in small rooms, because you didn't have a lot of windows necessarily, and white ceilings really helped to raise the level of interior illumination. It's also, I think, popular. The point about colour is that you can only apply earth pigments, water-based pigments to lime plaster straight away. If you want to add oil-based colours, you have to let it cure for a year before you paint them. And I think really a lot of people would not want to be bothered with workmen coming back again the following year to do yet more work. But no, white is almost always, not invariably, but almost always the finish. And it's just, sometimes it's just chalk in water, sometimes it's just white distemper. But
Can I just add one small thing to that, Claire?
Yes.
As I'm sure you probably know, and maybe James doesn't, the one thing that the plasterers were allowed to do in the 16th and 17th century was apply distemper and
yes.
whitening.
Yes.
So quite often, as Claire says, we did the plaster work, we then applied a colour white to it, and after a year, nobody bothered to change the colour.
I know how they feel once you've decorated, that's it. Now, talking of decorating their house, this is something the Master-elect's been doing.
Oh.
So would you like to tell us your plastering and painting woes, Margaret? No,
no, absolutely none. Absolutely none. Claire, thank you for that. That was delightful. You've actually, what you've done is you've encouraged me to go back to Rochester, because it is some time since I've last visited, but that was for the castle and the Medway, of course. But am I right in assuming that this is a World Heritage Site now?
Medway?
No, Eastgate House.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think it is. Oh, okay.
I mean, it's just part of the conservation area. It is an obviously a listed Grade 1 building, but no, not World Heritage.
It's not a heritage site. Okay, well, I will make an effort to get to visit it when it's open. I promise you.
I think you'll be taking a group of plasterers with you there, because
Maybe.
In the same way you've all heard.
Technical
Yeah, you've all heard about the City Bridge Trust and the medieval fund that looks after the 5 city bridges. Well, there is actually a similar fund from medieval times in Rochester, which pays for the bridge over the Medway there. And Claire and I were talking the other day. I mean, I knew it was quite wealthy, but apparently they actually paid for the tunnel under the river out of this fund. And they still are doing an awful lot of good in the locality there at Rochester. And the cathedral, which has a lovely choir, I know the dean, and the castle are all very, very well worth visiting. So yes.
And we also have a Huguenot Museum now.
Oh, Huguenot Museum, okay. And we can all catch up on our Charles Dickens
Yes.
memorabilia. Mind you, I've been doing lots of walks around London, and every corner's got a plaque to Charles Dickens. I must have found about 12 plaques to Charles Dickens in Southwark and Bloomsbury, all over the place. So he's a well-loved Prince, isn't he?
Yep.
Any other questions anybody wants to ask? No, we don't need to keep on asking questions. No. Claire, thank you very, very much. It was a delight, those pictures. Do you mind if I at least use one of them, perhaps in our newsletter or on our website, if that's all right? Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. So fascinating, and I know you blend so well, the knowledge of how you make plaster and what plaster is about and the history, but also with the architectural pieces around the house, and that was really a lovely visit. So thank you very much indeed. Now, folks, you might recall we are recording this, so if you have missed anything and want to see it again, it will be on the website, as the last 2 were. The first 2 weren't recorded, but the last 2 were. It is the whole hour, so it's me gabbering on and then you chattering as well. So anyway, I hope it will be interesting for everybody to see that again. As I said, this is the last of these, so thank you very much for attendance. But there is something very exciting happening next Tuesday.